Thank you, Patricia. Good morning, everybody, or maybe good afternoon for some of you. I'm Nancy Hart. I'm a senior program attorney here at the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, and I'm going to let my co-host introduce himself.
Hi, my name is Darren Mitchell. I'm located in Tacoma Park, Maryland, but I am a consultant to the National Council, and along with Nancy, I'm focused primarily on this Firearms Technical Assistance Project.
And so, as you know, this is a question and answer session today, and, that's really our goal, is to be available to address any questions that you have. But we thought we would very briefly review a couple of slides from our last webinar, which was called a pre-application webinar, just so that those of you who might not have seen that will give you a little bit of background before we break into questions. The Firearms TA project, the FTAP, has a number of objectives to provide intensive technical assistance to 5 to 7 diverse project sites around the country who are working to improve their response to firearms in either or both criminal and civil domestic violence cases. We also have an objective of obtaining and disseminating information about effective strategies and lessons learned from communities that have been doing some of this work or will be doing some of this work. We also plan to identify approaches that protect victims, children, and other people who are involved in domestic violence and firearms issues while promoting victim autonomy and safeguarding offenders' due process rights. There's sort of a balancing there. And then finally, we have an objective of facilitating peer-to-peer mentoring and using other vehicles and methods to promote idea sharing and problem solving among the sites that are selected as participating in this project. Next one, come on. I can't get that thing. Okay. The basic structure of the project is, again, to choose these 5 to 7 sites, 2 of which we're aiming to be tribal communities, and we're aiming to achieve the maximum diversity, and that's both in terms of geographic diversity around the country, demographic diversity, things like the large urban jurisdictions, small rural jurisdictions, as well as racial and ethnic diversity. Diversity within legal framework. We have some states who have really strong laws, and we have other states that have not so strong laws, and so we really want to incorporate sites from that whole range of legal framework. Diversity in terms of leadership that is at the community level, whether it's judicial leadership or law enforcement leadership or some other variety or combination. And then also diversity in terms of the challenges that need to be addressed. And the ultimate goal is that we have, from a diversity of sites, we will gain the most knowledge about how we can work with other jurisdictions in the future. So the focus, as I mentioned, can be on civil and criminal domestic violence cases. As a applying site, you can choose to just focus on one or the other, or you can choose to focus on both. There will be a focus on incorporating the voices and needs of traditionally underserved and or marginalized communities in your community. And again, we will be providing intensive TA and training, peer-to-peer mentoring, and idea sharing, both through all sites meetings and also through other methods, whether it might be online with technical assistance or with technology, or actually in-person site visits to one another. And then we do have funding for travel that would be to meetings within your state or within your jurisdiction to cover site visits, and any other training that we provide through the thing would be covered with our funding. The basic timeline for the project, we released the call for proposals in late July. It was re-released a month later, just in case people had been gone during the summer. And applications are going to be due on October 15th. Once we have all of the applications, we'll be choosing some sites for site visits to select potential, to narrow it down to the sites that we're going to choose. And those site visits are going to happen during December or January at this point. And then we expect to be notifying sites by March 1st. So during the month of February, we'll be digesting all of the input that we've received and working with the Office on Violence Against Women, which is our prime partner on this. And then once the sites are selected, we will begin the process of planning and ultimately implementing the projects at the different sites. And that will continue for 2 years, at least 2 years, from the fall, well, from the summer of next year until the fall of 2021. So with that in mind, we just want to open it up and see if you have questions at the get-go, and see what we can do to answer them.
And if you do have questions that you'd like to answer at this point, you can use the chat function, the chat box, which should be somewhere on your screen. You can just put your cursor right in that open box towards the bottom and then click on the little speech bubble, and we'll be able to see it.
And you can ask us questions about the application process, or components of the application that you're curious about, or about the project itself. We're here just like we're in the room with you, and you could ask us anything you want. Who the partners are, how we'll be doing this, whatever.
And we can jump in and share some questions that we've been asked previously, and some things that we think come up for folks around this project, just to get things going. And I see someone's typing, and we'll be happy to answer your question as well, of course. But one of the things that folks sometimes have asked us is whether the expectation is that sites would have some experience addressing specifically guns and domestic violence to be eligible, or for this project to be an appropriate one for their community. And really, we're trying to, we've been doing technical assistance work around guns and domestic violence for many, many years. The National Council has efforts dating back to the mid-90s on this. Nancy and I have done this work with communities around the country and various training programs and stuff for several years as well. And this was really an opportunity for us to do intensive, ongoing, on-site technical assistance and training and support for communities that are trying to improve their approach. And so our thought is we want to meet communities where they are. We know that many of them have tried things and have seen some success, or maybe have felt like the efforts didn't generate the level of improvement that they were seeking. And we also know that there are lots of people who have been wanting to do something but haven't had an opportunity yet. And we'd really like to try to serve all those sites. So any sort of previous efforts to address these issues may be helpful, but they're certainly not necessary for you to be an appropriate site, your community to be an appropriate place to do this work. So we strongly encourage you to apply. If there's an interest, if there's some ideas about the challenges that you're facing and how you that you'd specifically like to address as part of this project, then you're perfectly eligible to apply. I see that there's a question around flexibility to change the focus from what's proposed in the proposal. And actually, that is our third question here, which we know comes up. Are we locked into our project objectives once we get started, or once you are selected as a site based on the objectives in part that you've provided? Absolutely, there's an opportunity to change focus. Part of this is really a journey that your community will be undertaking with the technical assistance team there to help, to assist, to support, to facilitate conversations and things like that. And certainly as you move forward, you may find that something that you thought would be a primary focus is not, and something else emerges as a good target for this kind of work. And so there's tons of flexibility in that regard. We, certainly as part of the application process, are looking to see what your ideas are around the challenges you'd like to address. That helps us figure out whether you're appropriately within the scope of the work that should be done under this project, and also helps us in terms of the diversity of sites that Nancy mentioned earlier, that we have sites looking at different types of problems. But there's tons of flexibility once we get started, and we're pretty adaptable in our technical assistance to what you're interested in. So do not worry about being locked in from the beginning. I see someone else is typing, but go ahead, Nancy. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to add that I think we also imagine that, it's unlikely that there's just one challenge. I mean, it's possible that you only have one challenge, but, there's probably multiple challenges in your jurisdiction, and so there would be a handful of ways in which to approach it, that all of which you might mention, or some of which you might mention. So even if one of those objectives falls off the radar, there would still be other objectives that you might have articulated. But as Darren says, even if they're something that you hadn't even imagined at the beginning and you figure out later, we're going to be working with the sites as you learn these things, and we want to get to the goal of better implementation of firearms in your jurisdiction. So wherever that takes us is where we need to go.
And in terms of identifying some objectives for your project, some challenges to address, I want to make sure that you're aware that the solicitation itself has several ideas in it. There are a couple pages worth of potential project objectives and areas, challenge areas to work on. In addition, there are web links that you can see, hopefully, towards the bottom of your screen, that have previous webinars that we've done as part of this project over the last year and a half or so. That gives you a sense of the types of objectives that we have traditionally provided assistance with, and gives you a good framework for understanding what our approach to technical assistance in this area is. And a lot of it is about looking for opportunities in both the civil and mostly the civil protection order and the criminal justice systems in domestic violence cases, opportunities to learn about abusers' access to guns and then take steps to get those guns out of, to stop the abuser's ability to possess those guns if they're legally prohibited from doing so. And we think about the whole system as a continuum and lots of opportunities to get the information, get the firearms where they're illegally possessed, and have ideas for each of those stages of the processes for how you can consider doing that better. So our question is about the fact that there's federal laws governing possession of firearms for certain folks who are convicted or are subject to civil protection orders, which certainly is true. For those of you who aren't aware of all these laws, there are a set of federal laws that prohibit certain people from possessing guns, and misdemeanor crimes of domestic violence, those convictions, as well as qualifying civil protection orders, prohibit folks from purchasing or possessing or transporting firearms. Is there an expectation that we partner with our local U.S. Attorney's Office? Great question. So in our ideal world, every single site, every community in the country would have a robust collaboration with the U.S. Attorney's Office because of that office's ability to enforce the federal law, work with their federal colleagues to make sure that federal laws are enforced, including stopping purchases of guns based on federal law, etc. So ideally, yes, we would be all working towards those kinds of meaningful, robust, collaborative efforts with the U.S. Attorney's Office. But we know from our work over a couple of decades now that sometimes that can be difficult. And we have ideas and ways and also people who can help make that connection. So if that's something that you're interested in doing, we have the support for you and can strategize with you to make that happen. If you already have those and want to strengthen them, great. And if it's something that you think is not really part of what your community needs to do right now around guns, that's fine too. So there's lots of flexibility there. There's not an expectation of partnership, but we certainly would love to see all the sites eventually get to the point where they can develop those kinds of relationships. And this holds true not just for your federal counterparts, for those of you working at the state or the local level, your federal counterparts at the U.S. Attorney's offices or ATF or the FBI, but as well other community partners who maybe so far have not been part of efforts to address guns and domestic violence. Key stakeholders, whether they're the law enforcement agency, the prosecutor's office, the defense bar, probation, parole, or the courts. We certainly, a big sort of a foundation for our work is strong collaboration amongst the agencies and disciplines involved, and we would help you work towards that, but we recognize that that can be challenging in particular places with particular agencies, and so there's not an expectation that it's always going to work, but we would love to see you work towards those kinds of, developing those kinds of collaborations. I hope that answers your question, and if not, please follow up.
Just wanted to amplify on that too, in case you were sort of, Adam, were asking about, because we work not just with the federal law, but with the many state laws, because there might be jurisdictions who just aren't in a position to work with their U.S. attorney's offices on promoting the prosecution of federal laws. Because almost all states have some level of domestic violence firearms laws, even if what they have is a catch-all provision in their civil protection order statute. There are jurisdictions that are utilizing that catch-all provision to promote the surrender of firearms. And so when we say you don't have to collaborate with the U.S. attorney, it's because you, as Darren said, you might have decided that a big challenge in your jurisdiction is just enforcing the state laws that you have and working with your judges and your law enforcement agency around that.
And certainly follow up, please, Mr. Miller, if you have any other questions around that. There's a question from Becky Bullard. How will the work through these sites be communicated nationally after the project period? And, for example, if a community decides not to participate, will there still be opportunities to learn? That's an excellent question, and of course, I don't think we can be super specific about what the sort of lessons learned dissemination piece is going to look like, although we are committed to doing that as part of this project. As Nancy mentioned at the outset, we're really trying to learn from each other and then share those lessons with the broader community through our technical assistance and through training programs that we put on. We're intending that those TA efforts and trainings will continue through and beyond this project, and that will be one way that communities that don't participate will be able to learn about it. But in addition, we certainly have a real predilection toward putting out tools, documents, guidance, suggested practices in various areas, and I'm sure that this work will lead to that kind of thing. So, I wouldn't be surprised to see coming out of this work, working with law enforcement agencies, some ideas for what police protocols can look like to better address guns at the scene of a domestic violence incident and beyond. Bench cards for judges, guides for advocates for how to safety plan around firearms, and get information to the court about firearms, and then to follow up, and things like that, forms that are developed. So we will be, devoting time at the end of this project to trying to get that information out to the world, and that would be an opportunity to learn about what the sites have learned. There are also other technical assistance providers in addition to the National Council working on guns and domestic violence, most prominently the Better Women's Justice Project, which has a national resource center on firearms and domestic violence, and we work very closely with them. They're part of our project. We're part of their project. And so as things arise in our work under the FTAP, we're expecting that they'll be disseminated through the DV and Firearms Resource Center as well. If there were ever a national conference specific to firearms dispossession, I think it would be excellent. We've actually had a couple of national meetings over the years. One was done in which we call the Summit back in 2006 to address all these issues, and we invited teams from communities around the country, and actually came up with some pretty interesting ideas, and then worked with some of the participants afterwards to improve their systems. And then it took a while before another firearms-focused national meeting took place, and we did one. I think it was back in 2015, right, Nancy? Right. Which was a convening of folks who had some experience and expertise to share in this area. to help inform our work on this project, to help inform BWJP's work on the National Center, National Resource Center. And then we also held a tribal convening where folks who work on reservations and other tribal areas came together to talk about the specific issues faced by those communities. And so we've put some stuff together, but there's not been a large conference, sort of training conference, devoted to this issue in quite some time. So it's certainly something that maybe could come out of this work. So I don't see any other questions. We can continue with a couple of these other frequently asked questions, and again, folks should chat in if you have anything else you'd like to ask. So the second question we have on the slide that's showing now about having all the stakeholder partnerships in place to apply, including if you're having trouble engaging a particular partner, and this is really closely related to the question around the feds. Again, you don't have to have those all in place. We are here to help you. If you can identify who you'd like to have at the table and why, that's very helpful. But if you, but we're certainly in a position to try to help you get key stakeholders to buy into this work and to participate meaningfully. We have strategies for doing so, and can be there with you, including, as we mentioned earlier, we facilitate interdisciplinary work group meetings and things like that as part of this kind of work. Nancy already covered the focus on criminal system versus civil system. It's really optional. You can focus on either or both in your application. And again, as you move forward, you may find that you want to shift your focus over time.
And Darren, can I just add
Yes.
something to what you were saying about the stakeholders? I mean, we do expect that you will have some critical mass demonstrated by having at least two other stakeholder entities in your jurisdiction agreeing on the concept of the project. So, certainly you don't need to have all of the stakeholders, but we do want you to have, some meaningful demonstration that you have some collaboration or willingness to collaborate.
And certainly mention if you're already engaged in collaborative efforts, if folks have shown leadership in your community on this or other domestic violence related issues, and things that help us to understand the history of your work in this area and some of the efforts that you've engaged in, so we have a sense of what it looks like, what it would look like to do the work there, and also
well,
how.
And I guess,
go ahead.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, it's fine.
Well, I was just going to embellish that. I mean, really, stepping back, collaboration and leadership are some of the absolutely core concepts that we think are essential in success on this work. So that's actually a huge part of what we will be helping you build in your communities is better collaboration and strong leadership. So on the one hand, describing anything that you already have is obviously important, but we do not expect you to have it all figured out as far as any of the collaboration or the leadership, because we understand that's the critical stuff that we need to be helping with. So.
Great. There's a question around the ideal size of a management team, and I do think that's a great question. And this is based on experience with other projects that are kind of similar to this one in terms of selecting some sites to do the work, and then having an expectation that the sites will have a group of core folks who are responsible for oversight and management of the project, who will directly communicate with the technical assistance team, with the Office on Violence Against Women, etc., about the project in many instances, and will convene a larger collaborative work group and other groups of folks who may meet about particular topics or at certain intervals, whatever. So based on working with communities that are doing this kind of work, I've seen them range from 6 to 12 folks, I would say. And some of you may think that 6 is a lot for a management team, and part of the reason is because of the interdisciplinary nature of the group. So ideally, I would say, and this is kind of a personal preference, and I think there's lots of flexibility here. But if you have folks that represent the sort of key stakeholder disciplines at the table, that can be really important. And so, typically that's going to be at least 6 folks when you consider all the different agencies that are involved in this kind of work. So, from my perspective, although, this is not set in stone, and certainly to the extent that you explain who's on the team and why, and how it's going to work cohesively, there's plenty of flexibility. But I would say, at least try to include the key relevant stakeholders. So that takes you from 6 to maybe 10 or 12 folks. And then we talk about, as part of these projects, a larger collaborative work group, which would involve maybe, multiple stakeholders from multiple people from particular stakeholder groups, all the key victim service providers. We have a real focus in this project, as we mentioned a couple times, on working with traditionally underserved and marginalized communities. So folks who work for culturally specific organizations and those that work with specific populations would be very appropriate members of that, and also of the management team potentially too of the project. So so I really think it's going to be very site specific, but we're not looking for just 2 or 3 people who would be managing the project. And we're certainly not looking for a management team that's going to be unwieldy and like 15 people or something like that. I hope that helps. Do you have anything to add to that, Nancy?
No, I think that's right.
So we already mentioned to some extent the type of support and assistance you can expect if you participate in the project. We talked a little bit about the fact that we do trainings, and we'll consult with you on a regular basis. We'll come to your site, and part of what we do is help you through a process of identifying, in the application process you would identify some objectives and some of the challenges you want to address. But early in the project, in the sort of planning stages, as you're working to put together your management team, your collaborative work group, et cetera, and pull folks together, we're also engaged in an effort to be more specific about the objectives of the project and the steps that will lead toward the activities that will lead towards achieving those objectives. And so we will typically do a sort of mapping exercise on site with project sites, where they'll sit down and they'll look at their criminal and or civil protection order systems, identify what the process looks like. Usually we try to do it from a survivor or victim-focused approach, what the whole overall experience from when you want to try to do something about this through you get an order issued or there's a conviction, what happens after that, and identify where the strengths are, where the challenges or gaps are. And using that information, going through that process, you get sort of a shared understanding of your processes, because it's a very interesting exercise to go through, as people have different perspectives on these particular steps and really learn from each other about what it really looks like on the ground. And then as you identify the gaps and the challenges, that really helps you figure out what you may want to focus on as part of the project. So we facilitate those kinds of meetings to help you identify potential challenges to address, to identify project objectives, and then we come in and we can facilitate meetings with stakeholder groups. We can do things by telephone for you. We can share resources from other communities that have done this work. So we have sample forums, sample protocols, other things like that can help you, that you can potentially adapt or think about as you're developing your own resources, policies, and processes. And so there's a lot of, and we facilitate that sort of peer-to-peer mentoring and conversation as part of this work as well. So instead of just listening to national technical assistance providers all the time, we connect you with your colleague in another jurisdiction that's already done the work, so you can have a real, on-the-ground conversation about the challenges they faced, how they overcome them, and what ultimately worked. So that's sort of our approach to technical assistance in this area, and you could expect a lot of that kind of work going on with you in a very focused way. The financial support Nancy already mentioned, which is really around your ability to travel, especially to technical assistance opportunities and training opportunities, as well as all sites meetings. Our hope is that down the line there may be some additional funding for these projects, and we're constantly working with OVW to explore those possibilities. And in addition to that, as I'm sure most or all of you are aware of, there are other sources of funding, both federal funding and at the state level and sometimes private foundation funding to do this work. And certainly we think that going through especially the initial stages of planning out this project and starting to implement it would put you in a great position to apply for other OVW grants that are out there, including the ICJR grants, the Improving the Criminal Justice Response, the former Grants to Encourage Arrest and Enforcement Protection Order Grant Program, the Justice for Families, Legal Assistance for Victims, and other grant programs are possibilities as well. Of course, at the state level, there may be VOCA funds available, STOP funds available, et cetera. So it's hard to say what that would look like down the road at this point, and there's no commitment at this time from the Office on Violence Against Women to have any funding beyond the travel. But we certainly understand that sustainability is a huge issue, and it's something that we would work with you all as project sites on.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So another question that we have up there that we frequently have spoken to people about is the perception that you are in a community that has a really strong gun culture that makes it impossible or certainly challenging to take on implementing firearms restrictions in domestic violence cases. So we are definitely prepared to work with you on that. I mean, we don't have a quick fix or any magic, but we do have some strategies and some tools that we think have been helpful in communities that have dealt with that. And it has, largely has to do with viewing the problem of domestic violence and firearms as a public health issue, and coming to approaching it from that standpoint tends to bring more people to the table in the first place, because it's, again, something that is affecting the public health of the community and from a safety standpoint. And we also utilize some practices that help a divergent group of people realize that they have common values underlying what they do, and so we do exercises that help different members of the community understand what their perceptions of one another are, and also what their perceptions of a particular problem are. And it helps to develop an underlying common set of values about the system in which you're working, and that can lead to better understandings of why you're trying to do this. So, I mean, it's not complicated, but it may not sound very clear in just an articulation, but we do have some approaches for working with a community that is dealing with some fairly distinct opposition to this. And that's, again, something that we would expect to be front and center of a particular project. It doesn't have to be something that we figure out at the beginning. It may be threaded through the whole project. Darren, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Nope, that sounds good. And I think that last question, the sustainability piece, I tried to address earlier.
Yeah. I mean, partly we know that collaboration is something that goes on between people in a community over many years, and so it's an ongoing challenge to keep that collaboration alive and meaningful and robust. And sometimes it's not a matter of funding, but it's a matter of time more than anything else. So we again have some strategies that we would be helping to implement and help you put into place that would maximize those things. Are there any questions that we haven't touched upon, small or big?
I was going to point one other thing out, Nancy, which I'm trying to do right now, but it doesn't seem to be working.
Well, we have eligible applicants up.
Oh, okay. It's not showing up on my screen.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to, because we have had a couple of questions about eligibility for applying, and we have a list, but so folks of that, we've had, interestingly, a couple of questions, an indication of interest from folks who work at the state, whether it's through a statewide administrative office of the court or a state domestic violence coalition, asking whether that they were appropriate or eligible applicants for this project. And at this point, what we're telling folks is that the sort of the goal and understanding for this project is that we're going to work with specific communities to help them address challenges around implementation of the firearms laws. And so to the extent that the statewide applicants are committed to working with specific community, a specific community or a couple of specific communities within their state, that would be an appropriate project site. Because certainly the activities would be similar to what the other sites are doing. The lessons learned would be helpful for other folks as well. So certainly, if you have questions about that, further questions about that, definitely get in touch because we'd love to talk to you about how this project could potentially work, and even if you're trying to do it at a level other than just a local stakeholder. Applying for to be part of the project.
And then maybe we can put our contact information up. Where is that one? I think we don't have your number up here. I don't. Is it showing up? Resources?
Yeah, it's showing up for me.
Oh, that one's blank for me. Okay. But that has my email.
Yeah, so nhart at ncjfcj.org is probably the best way to get a hold of us.
Right.
Thank you, Patricia, for putting that up.
Yeah. So, if you come up with things after this is closed, you're welcome to send me an email, and between me and Darren, we will get back to you.
Yeah, we really thank you for your interest in the project and for joining us today.
And I just want to reiterate something that's in the solicitation that has to do with sending me a letter of intent to apply, which is not a requirement. It's just a request of ours so that we get a sense of how many applications we might be getting. And the deadline for that, as I recall, is September 10th. And by letter of intent, I am just looking for literally a one-line email saying we are intending to apply. So if any of you are in that, if you know that you're applying, and frankly, even if you aren't sure, but you think you are, you can always change your mind. We're not going to track you down if you fail to submit an application. But again, it would just give us an idea of who might be applying. Okay. Well, it doesn't look like we have any other questions. So we will probably wrap up at this point. And thank you very much for your interest and for listening in.
All right, everyone. Take care and have a good day.